On the day my dad passed away, I said nothing about the $28 inheritance or about the skyscraper in New York City under my name. That same night, my stepmom screamed, "Pack your bags, you're not staying here." I said, "Okay." Then I decided to do something that my words froze her. My father remarried when I was 19, 6 years after my mother died. I was already out of the house by then, finishing college 2 states away, so most of what I knew about the marriage came in fragments. Holiday visits, phone calls, the occasional weekend home. My stepmother wasn't unkind to me. She just treated me like a fact of my father's life she'd agreed to accept rather than someone she was curious about. The building was mine. It had been mine since I was 13, since my mother died and left her interest in it to a trust in my name. She'd inherited it from her own father, who'd built it decades earlier in a part of the city that was industrial then and wasn't anymore by the time I was born. 22 stories, retail below, offices above. It required decisions a 13-year-old couldn't make, and the trust had anticipated that by naming my father as the person who'd make them until I was old enough myself. He took it seriously. He attended the quarterly meetings. He reviewed the leases. When the roof needed replacing when I was 16, he fielded the bids and picked the contractor. And by the time I was old enough for limited input, he started walking me through decisions instead of just making them. By 30, full control passed to me under the trust's terms, and his role shifted from steward to sounding board. He'd call sometimes just to ask how the building was doing, the way you'd ask about a garden you used to tend. He never once, in my memory, called it his. My stepmother heard a different version of all of that because she was only ever present for the parts that looked like ownership from the outside. She heard him take calls about refinancing. She watched him review renovation budgets at the kitchen table. She heard him discuss tenant problems with the easy familiarity of someone discussing his own affairs, because in a sense, for years, he had been. No one ever sat her down and explained the structure. That was the real failure. Not malice, just the ordinary habit of assuming a spouse understands the shape of your life without you having to draw it out. He assumed she understood he was managing something on my behalf. She assumed, reasonably enough from where she stood, that a man who spent that much attention on a property owned it. 20 years of proximity will do that to a person's understanding of who something belongs to. I noticed the assumption a few times and let it pass. At a holiday dinner once, she mentioned his building downtown to a family friend, and the words landed wrong in my ear without my quite knowing why until later that night. I could have corrected her. I didn't, partly because it would have taken a longer conversation than the moment allowed, and partly because I didn't feel obligated to manage what she believed about my finances. We were civil. We weren't close. She'd never asked me a real question about my life, the kind that implies actual curiosity, and I'd stopped expecting one somewhere in my late 20s, so the misunderstanding calcified, the way these things do when nobody has a reason to correct them. He kept advising. She kept assuming. I kept building my own life around a property that had quietly become, over 2 decades, the largest asset either of them would ever touch, and nobody in that house ever said the sentence that would have made the truth impossible to misread. I used to think there'd be time for that sentence eventually. I was wrong about that, the way you're wrong about most things you assume you have time for. His final week didn't feel dramatic while I was living through it. He went in for what was supposed to be a routine cardiac procedure, developed complications overnight, and never really recovered. I flew down the second day. My stepmother barely left his room. Neither did I for 4 days straight. Hospital coffee, whispered updates from nurses, the exhaustion of waiting for doctors to say something different than the day before. He died just after noon on a Thursday. There was no final confession, no deathbed document, no last-minute instruction about money or property. His estate plan had been in place for years by then, drafted and revised the ordinary way. Nothing urgent about it. Whatever I inherited, I'd inherit because of paperwork that already existed, not because of anything said in that room. That evening, my stepmother and I drove back to the house in near silence. I offered to call the estate attorney, a man who'd handled my father's affairs for over a decade. She said she already knew how to reach him. I asked if she wanted help notifying extended family. She said no. Then I got up and walked toward my father's office to retrieve a phone charger I'd left on his desk that morning. She followed me down the hall. "Don't start going through his files," she said. I stopped in the doorway. I wasn't. I know how these things work. I looked at her for a second, trying to figure out what she thought was happening. "I'm getting my charger," I said. She crossed her arms. "I don't want anything removed from this house. I'm not removing anything that belongs to him." Her expression hardened. "This is my house now," she said. I already knew that. The house had been structured that way years earlier, and I'd never expected otherwise. It had never occurred to me to want it. Still, she seemed to need me to say it back to her, so I did. "Yes, it is." That should have ended it. Instead, she pointed toward the guest room where my bag still sat from 4 days of hospital visits. "Pack your bags," she said. "You're not staying here." I looked at her for a second. She'd clearly braced for an argument. I could see it in her shoulders. I didn't give her one. "Okay," I said. That answer seemed to throw her more than resistance would have. I went upstairs and packed the same bag I'd been living out of for 4 days. Clothes, laptop, charger, toiletries, nothing from his desk, nothing from his closet, nothing that could be mistaken for taking something that wasn't mine, because I understood, even in that moment, that whatever came next was going to depend on nobody being able to say I'd acted first. At the front door, she said the lawyers could contact me when there was something I was entitled to. I could have told her then. I could have said the building she'd spent 20 years believing was his had never been his at all, that the number attached to my share of the estate was going to be larger than anything she was imagining, that the sentence nobody in that house had ever said out loud was about to become impossible to avoid. None of that would have changed the fact that I needed to leave, so I left it unsaid, picked up my bag, and walked out to my car. From the hotel that that night, before I'd even unpacked, I opened my laptop and wrote one email to the estate attorney. I want every asset discussed by legal ownership first, I told him. No assumptions, because by then I understood something my stepmother didn't yet. The conversation ahead was never going to be about who'd loved my father more or who deserved to grieve in that house. It was going to be about who actually owned what. And for 20 years, almost nobody in that family had bothered to ask. The next few days were quieter than people imagine after someone with real assets dies. There's no vault opening, no dramatic reading of a will, none of what television trains you to expect. There are phone calls, death certificates, funeral arrangements to coordinate around a stepmother I was no longer speaking to directly, handled instead through a funeral home liaison who probably thought our family's cold formality was grief and not, in my case, something closer to strategy. I stayed at the hotel and worked remotely when I could manage it. I didn't call my stepmother. I didn't contact the building's management team to tell them anything had changed, because nothing had. My father's death didn't alter who owned that building, and I wasn't going to let anyone's assumptions rush me into acting like it might. The estate attorney called 2 days after the funeral arrangements were finalized. His name was a family fixture by then, someone who'd known my mother before she died and had watched my father raise me afterward, which meant he understood the actual shape of my finances better than almost anyone else alive. I got your email, he said. Every asset by legal ownership first. That's how I was already planning to run it. But I want to make sure you understand what that means once we're in the room with her. I understand what it means. She's going to hear, in front of witnesses, that the thing she's believed for 20 years isn't true. That's not going to go the way she expects. I know. He was quiet for a second. You could tell her before the meeting. Soften it. I thought about that. Actually thought about it, standing in a hotel room 3 days after my father's funeral with a phone against my ear. If I tell her now, I said, she'll spend the next 5 days rehearsing an argument instead of hearing the actual facts. I'd rather she hear it once from someone who isn't me, with the documents already on the table. That's a colder approach than I expected from you. It's not cold. It's accurate. Those aren't the same thing. He scheduled the reading for 5 days out, enough time for the trustee's office to pull the original formation documents, the transfer records, everything that would need to sit on a table in front of a woman who was about to learn that 15 years of proximity had never once equaled ownership. I spent those 5 days the way I imagine most people spend the days before something they know is coming and can't speed up. Working, sleeping badly, rehearsing nothing, because there was nothing to rehearse. The facts didn't need my help. What I didn't do in those 5 days was feel triumphant about any of it. People assume there's some satisfaction in being right when someone else has spent decades being wrong. And maybe for some people there is. What I felt mostly was tired and a specific kind of sad that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with realizing how long a misunderstanding can survive inside a family simply because nobody wanted the discomfort of correcting it. My stepmother called twice during those 5 days. I let both go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know what I'd say to her that wouldn't either give something away too early or sound like an accusation I wasn't ready to make yet. The voicemails, when I finally listened to them, were carefully neutral. Logistics about the funeral, a question about whether I wanted anything from the house before it went into whatever process houses go into. No mention of the building. No mention of money at all, which struck me as its own kind of tell. Coming from a woman who'd never once in 11 years asked me a real question about my life, but had apparently always known, on some level, not to ask too directly about finances either. I went to the funeral on the 4th day. It was smaller than I expected. Mostly people from his old company and a handful of relatives I hadn't seen in years. My stepmother sat in the front row with her sister. I sat 2 rows back with an aunt on my mother's side, which felt correct in a way I didn't examine too closely at the time. We didn't speak beyond a nod at the reception afterward. She looked smaller than usual, the way people do at funerals, grief flattening out whatever performance they'd normally be running. I almost told her then. Standing near the coffee urn at the reception, watching her accept condolences from people who'd known my father for decades, I felt the specific pull toward mercy that I imagine most people feel at funerals, the urge to soften whatever's coming, to spare someone one more blow on a day that's already delivered the worst one. I didn't act on it, partly because the attorney was right, that telling her early would just give her 5 more days to build a defense against facts that didn't require defending, and partly, if I'm being honest with myself the way I've tried to be through all of this, because some part of me still hadn't forgiven her for the 4 days in that hospital, for the pack your bags delivered before my father had been dead even 12 hours. Mercy has its limits. Mine ran out somewhere around day 2 of sleeping in a hotel room paid for out of my own account, while she slept in a house I'd never once resented her for having. The days between the funeral and the reading passed the way I imagine they pass for most people in that position. Work as distraction, sleep that didn't quite reach the bottom of actual rest, a low hum of anticipation I couldn't turn off no matter how deliberately I tried to occupy my hours. I reviewed nothing about the case because there was nothing to review. The documents existed. The trust had existed for 20 years. All I had to do was show up and let the paper do what paper does when it's finally allowed to speak. The reading was held at the attorney's office downtown, a building I'd been in a handful of times over the years for routine trust business, always in the same small conference room with the same view of a parking structure across the street. My stepmother arrived first, with her sister beside her, already talking in the low, urgent tone of someone rehearsing a version of events she needed to believe before she could perform it convincingly. I heard fragments through the closed door before I walked in. His building, 15 years, no reason he wouldn't have. I came in a few minutes after. A representative from the corporate trustee's office joined shortly shortly behind me, carrying a folder thick enough that my stepmother's eyes went to it immediately and stayed there. The attorney began with the parts that were straightforward, the parts nobody was going to contest. The house remained hers. My father had structured it that way years earlier, and I'd never once wanted otherwise. Certain retirement and beneficiary accounts passed directly to her. A marital trust would provide long-term security, more than enough that she'd never need to worry about money again in any practical sense. She sat through all of it nodding, arms crossed, waiting for something I could tell she considered the actual point of the meeting. I said nothing through any of it, not because I was holding something back out of malice, but because none of it was mine to comment on. My father had made those decisions years before any of us were sitting in that room, and they weren't in dispute. The attorney moved through the estate slowly, the way he always did, separating everything into categories: joint property, beneficiary designated accounts, trust property, business interests, assets that would need formal valuation before anything could be distributed. My stepmother kept glancing at me between each category, like she was waiting for me to object to something, and each time I had nothing, which seemed to unsettle her more than an actual objection would have. Finally, she leaned forward, unable to wait any longer for him to reach the part she'd come for. "What happens to the building?" she said. "The one downtown." His. The attorney didn't look up right away. He turned one more page first, the way I'd watched him do 100 times in smaller meetings over the years. A small, unhurried habit that had never meant anything until this exact moment, when it meant everything. "Which building?" he said. "Are we discussing?" "Which building?" he said again. "Are we discussing?" "Your husband's estate includes an interest in 2 commercial properties. I want to make sure we're looking at the correct file before anyone gets ahead of the documents." My stepmother's shoulders dropped, visibly, like she'd been holding tension somewhere and had just been given permission to release it. "2, she said. "See, I told you there was more than one. The one downtown, the tower." He opened a folder and slid a single page across the table. "This is a minority interest your husband held in a small commercial property upstate, jointly with 2 former business partners from early in his career. It's valued modestly. It passes to you directly under the terms of his will. No complications." My stepmother looked at the page, then at her sister, then back at the attorney with something close to triumph settling into her face. "So there is a building," she said. "I wasn't imagining it." "There's a building," he agreed. "This one." For a moment, the room felt almost resolved, like we'd arrived at the thing everyone had been bracing for, and it had turned out smaller than expected. Survivable. A number on a page instead of a war. My stepmother sat back, some of the rigidity leaving her posture already halfway to relief. Her sister patted her hand. I watched her exhale for what looked like the first time since she'd walked in. I didn't say anything. I already knew this wasn't the conversation we were actually there to have. "There's one more item," the attorney said, turning to the next section of his folder. "Before we finish today." He let the small relief sit in the room for a moment before he continued, which I understood even then as a kind of professional mercy, giving her 30 seconds of feeling like she'd been right about something before the folder in front of him told a different story. "The item I want to discuss," he said, "is a beneficial interest under your husband's estate plan. This is separate from any specific property. It's a valuation of his overall financial position, structured through several accounts and investment vehicles." My stepmother nodded along without really listening, still riding the small victory of the upstate property, still glancing occasionally at her sister like they were sharing a private joke about how the meeting had gone easier than either of them expected. "Based on current valuations," the attorney continued, "the figure comes to approximately $11 million. The number landed differently than I expected. My stepmother's face didn't collapse or light up. It just went still, the way faces do when a number is too large to have an immediate emotional reaction to, when the brain needs a few seconds just to process the digits before it can decide how to feel about them. 11, she repeated. "That's the figure. Yes. It includes the marital trust we discussed earlier, along with several other accounts that passed to you under the will. To me. To you, yes. Your husband structured his estate to provide substantially for you." I watched her do the math in real time, watched her run through some private calculation about what $11 million meant relative to whatever number she'd been quietly expecting or fearing. Whatever she landed on seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment. Her shoulders, which had never fully returned to their earlier tension, stayed loose. She thanked him. She thanked the trustee representative. She looked, for the first time since I'd walked into that office, like a woman who believed the worst was behind her. We left separately. She and her sister went one direction toward the parking garage. I went the other, toward my car, and neither of us said anything to the other beyond the barest professional nod that people exchange when they've just spent 2 hours in a room together, discussing money and grief in the same breath. I drove back to the hotel and sat in the parking lot for a while before going inside, engine off, just processing what had and hadn't happened in that room. She'd gotten a number large enough to feel secure. She'd gotten a small property that let her feel vindicated about something she'd insisted on for years. She had no idea, driving home in that moment, that the actual conversation, the one about a 22-story building and a figure nearly 3 times the one she'd just heard, hadn't happened yet at all. I didn't feel triumphant about that either. I felt, if anything, like I was watching someone walk calmly toward a door I already knew led somewhere much worse than the room she thought she was leaving. She called me 4 days later. I almost didn't answer, but something in the pattern of her calling twice, back to back, the way people call when they're not going to let voicemail stop them, made me pick up. "I want to talk about the tower," she said. No greeting first. "There's nothing to talk about. It wasn't part of the estate." "That's not what I'm asking. I want to talk about why nobody told me it existed as a separate thing at all. 15 years, and not one conversation where anyone said, by the way, this building isn't actually his." I could hear something underneath her voice that hadn't been there in the attorney's office. this. Not triumph, not relief, something closer to the specific anger of realizing you've been quietly wrong about something for a very long time, and nobody thought it worth correcting. I didn't manage what you believed, I said. I never told you it was his. You assumed that on your own. He let me believe it. Every phone call, every meeting, every renovation budget at our kitchen table. He let all of that happen without once saying it wasn't his to manage in the way I thought. He was managing it because I was a child when my mother died. That's not the same as owning it. You keep saying that like it's supposed to make me feel better. I'm not trying to make you feel anything. I'm telling you what's true. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought she might have hung up. Then, I've hired my own attorney. I want everything reviewed independently. The trust documents, the formation records, all of it. That's your right. You're very calm about this. I've had longer to get used to the facts than you have. That landed harder than I intended it to, or maybe exactly as hard as I intended, and I just didn't want to admit that to myself in the moment. She hung up without saying anything else. Her attorney contacted the estate office 2 days later, requesting the full trust history. I wasn't surprised. I'd have done the same thing in her position. Nobody accepts a reversal of that size on the word of a single meeting. Not when the number attached to it was still unknown to her. Not when everything she'd believed for 15 years had just been declared false in a conference room by a man she'd never fully trusted to begin with. What she didn't know yet, because nobody had told her, was that the $11 million figure from the reading wasn't the full picture. It was the estate figure, what passed to her, what my father had left behind for her security. It had nothing to do with what I stood to receive separately from a combination of the trust and my own beneficial interest in his broader financial plan. Nobody in that room had said the second number out loud yet, because the attorney had structured the meeting to handle one revelation at a time, the way you'd set a bone before asking someone to walk on it. 3 weeks passed while her attorney reviewed everything the estate office sent over. The formation documents for the trust, the transfer records from when my mother died, the distribution paperwork from when I turned 30, and full control passed to me. I didn't hear from her directly during any of it. I went back to work, back to my own life, back to managing the building that had apparently caused this much quiet devastation simply by existing under my name instead of hers. Her attorney called the estate office at the end of the 3rd week and asked to schedule a follow-up meeting. He didn't say why. I found out later it was because he'd reached the same conclusion the estate attorney had reached from the beginning, and he needed to be the one to tell her, in person, that there was no claim to make, that the building had never been contestable to begin with, and that the number attached to my actual inheritance was going to be substantially larger than anything discussed in that first meeting. I agreed to the follow-up meeting without knowing exactly what it would contain. I assumed it would simply confirm what we already knew. I didn't yet understand that this second meeting was going to be the one where everything actually changed, where the number I'd been carrying quietly for weeks would finally have to be said out loud, in a room, to a woman who still believed the worst news was already behind her. The second meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Same conference room, same view of the parking structure across the street that I'd started to associate with bad news delivered in measured, professional tones. I arrived early this time, wanting a few minutes to sit with the documents the attorney had prepared before anyone else came in. He'd laid everything out chronologically on the table. The trust formation from when my mother died, the fiduciary agreements from my childhood, the distribution paperwork from when I turned 30, and beneath all of that, a valuation summary I hadn't seen the final version of until that morning. I'd known the rough shape of the number for weeks. Seeing it typed out in an official document, with decimal points and account references and the flat, unemotional language that estate attorneys use for numbers that would change most people's entire understanding of their life, was different than knowing it in the abstract. You've seen this, the attorney said, nodding at the summary. The rough version, not the final. The final's not far off from the rough version, just more precise about where everything sits. My stepmother arrived a few minutes later, alone this time. No sister beside her, which struck me as significant, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Her own attorney came in behind her, a younger man I hadn't met before, carrying a leather folder that looked considerably thinner than the one the attorney had prepared, which told me something about how the 3 weeks of review had probably gone for them. She sat across from me without the same rigid posture from the first meeting. Something in her had softened, or maybe just tired, in the interval since the last time we'd been in this room together. She didn't look at me the way she had at the funeral reception, distant and composed. She looked, if anything, like someone bracing for a diagnosis she already suspected, but hadn't yet had confirmed by someone with the authority to make it official. Her attorney spoke first. We've completed our independent review of the trust documentation. I want to be direct about our findings, because I think that's more useful to everyone than drawing this out. The estate attorney nodded for him to continue. The trust formed upon her mother's death is valid. The transfer of interest is properly documented. There's no procedural irregularity, no ambiguity in the formation language, nothing that would support a claim that the building in question was ever part of your husband's individually owned assets. He paused, glancing at my stepmother before continuing. We don't see a viable path to contesting ownership. My stepmother's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slightly. Not into fists exactly, just a small unconscious tightening that I recognized as someone absorbing a piece of news they'd been quietly hoping their own lawyer would somehow overturn. I know that's not what you wanted to hear, her attorney said more gently. I didn't hire you to tell me what I wanted to hear. I hired you to find out the truth. This is the truth. The building was never his to leave you, because it was never his to begin with. She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the table rather than at either attorney rather than at me. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of the sharpness it carried on the phone 4 days after the first first meeting. 15 years, she said, mostly to herself. I sat in that house for 15 years watching him take those calls. He was managing an asset on his daughter's behalf, the estate attorney said, not unkindly. That's a real thing people do. It doesn't create ownership. It creates responsibility. Nobody ever explained the difference to me. I understand that. I think, in fairness, that's a failure that sits with the family, not with the documents. The documents were never ambiguous. The communication around them was. I hadn't said anything yet. I'd been waiting, the way I'd learned to wait through every version of this conversation over the past several weeks, for the moment when the actual scope of what she didn't know would finally have to be addressed directly rather than around. The estate attorney seemed to sense the same thing, because he turned to the next section of his folder, the valuation summary I'd already seen that morning, and slid it toward the center of the table where both attorneys and my stepmother could see it clearly. There's one more figure we need to discuss today, he said, before this meeting concludes. And I want to be clear that what I'm about to say is separate from everything we've covered so far. The house, the marital trust, the $11 million figure from our first meeting. This is a different number entirely, and it's the reason I wanted both attorneys present for this conversation rather than handling it by phone. My stepmother looked up from the table for the first time in several minutes. Different from the 11 million, she repeated slowly, like she already sensed, in the half second before he said anything further, that whatever came next was going to be larger than she'd let herself imagine. Considerably different, the estate attorney said. He turned the page. There were, based on the completed valuation, the estate attorney said, the beneficial interest passing to your stepdaughter under your husband's estate plan, separate from the marital trust, separate from the 11 million we discussed at the first meeting, comes to approximately $28 million. Nobody in the room moved for a moment. My stepmother's attorney looked down at his own copy of the summary like he was checking whether he'd misread something. My stepmother herself didn't say anything at all, not right away, which was somehow worse than if she had. 28, she finally said. That's the figure, yes. It includes securities, private investment interests, and a portion of the trust that required final valuation before it could be confirmed. And the building, her voice had gone very quiet, the tower downtown, is that included in that number, or is that separate too? That building was never part of your husband's estate, the estate attorney said. It belongs to her independently, through her mother's side, and has for over 2 decades. It doesn't factor into any of the numbers we've discussed today, because it was never his to leave. I watched something shift behind my stepmother's eyes, a recalibration happening in real time, the same one I imagined had been building slowly since the first meeting, but was only now arriving at its full size. 15 years of watching a man discuss a building at the kitchen table, 15 years of assuming proximity meant ownership. And underneath all of that, this whole time, a second number, $28 million, entirely unconnected to the tower, that existed separately, that she hadn't even known to ask about because she hadn't known it existed. You knew this, she said, looking at me directly for the first time since sitting down. This whole time, the night I told you to pack your bags, you already knew. I knew what my father's plan said. I didn't know the final number until recently. Valuations take time, but I knew the shape of it. And you said nothing. You weren't asking me what I owned, I said. You were telling me to leave. Her attorney shifted in his seat, the posture of a man recognizing that his client's case had just gotten considerably harder to argue, though there had never really been a case to begin with. Just an assumption 20 years in the making, finally meeting the paperwork that had been sitting quietly underneath it the entire time. I want to be clear, the estate attorney said, that this figure isn't liquid cash sitting in an account. It includes assets that will take time to distribute properly, but the number itself isn't in dispute. It's confirmed. My stepmother looked down at the table again, at the summary with its careful columns and its flat, unemotional language for a number large enough to reorganize an entire understanding of a marriage. When she looked back up, whatever composure she'd been holding on to since the first meeting had finally, visibly, come apart. 15 years, she said again, and this time it didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like someone doing arithmetic on her own life and not liking the total. The estate attorney closed the folder gently, the way you close something when you know the hardest part of a conversation has just happened and there's nothing left to add that would help. There's one more document, he said, that I think you both need to see before we end today. He reached into the folder and pulled out a single page, different from the others. No letterhead, no formal formatting, just a photocopy of something handwritten. This surfaced during the final review of the trust files, the estate attorney said. It's dated 3 weeks before your husband's surgery. My office found it while confirming the valuation. I wasn't going to raise it today, but given what's already been said, I think you both need to see it before this meeting ends. He turned it so it faced my stepmother first. She read it once, quickly. The way people read something they don't yet understand is important. Then she read it again, slower, and I watched her hand come up to cover her mouth before she'd even finished the second line. That's not, she started, and stopped. It's his handwriting, the estate attorney said quietly. We had it verified against 3 other documents in the file. She looked up at me, and for the first time since the night she'd told me to pack my bags, I couldn't read anything in her expression at all. Not anger, not grief, not the careful composure she'd been holding onto through 2 meetings and 3 weeks of independent review. Just something closer to shock. The specific kind that arrives after you think you've already absorbed the worst news available and discover there was more underneath it. Did you know about this? She said. It wasn't really a question. No, I said. I've never seen that page in my life. She slid it across the table toward me without a word, her hand shaking slightly against the polished wood, and I looked down to read what my father had apparently written 3 weeks before he died. A piece of paper nobody in that room, not her, not me, not even the attorney who who'd held my family's affairs for over a decade had known existed until 5 minutes ago.